We are concerned not merely with the technical problem of securing and maintaining peace, but also with the important task of education and enlightenment.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world tonight. This is Grant Cameron, and I'm doing a very special show today. I'm very excited. As you know, I put out a book called Contact Modalities. Desta Barnaby and I put it out. And in the book, we did radios. The Canadian government had worked with radios, had done communication with AFA, an alien that they were in contact with. And in the book, we were doing all the different modalities of radios and channeling and all this kind of stuff. And we heard rumors of some guys who were playing with radios. And I heard this from my friend Mark Vidovic, and I said, well, what's going on? We were doing this book. And he said, well, it's kind of secret. They're sort of still working on this and not ready to go public or whatever. So I think we sort of mentioned this in the book. And I have one of the people that's the key to this whole thing. And that is Mark Sims, who's joining me today from California. And he's the guy with the radios. We're going to get into that. We're going to get into his story. We're going to get into his background. I say, as people know, I talk about the theory of wow, that the more I look at it, the more I think this may not be as ET as people think it is. And this may be a lot of just simply making us go wow, realizing we are not alone. We are, the reality is more than what we think it is. And of all the wow stuff I've seen, I think this is the wowiest stuff I've ever seen. This is like, I say, like crop circles on steroids. When you see what Mark and Jimmy, who was actually the guy that started it, have been able to do with these radios, once this gets going, this is going to be viral around America and around the world. This is fascinating stuff if you know what's going on. So good evening, Mark, and thank you for joining me. And I hope we can have a couple of conversations because I know you're working on this. You've got all sorts of experiments going, and we are going to get involved with it in Canada. And I told you I was going to get the Canadian government involved. And so I'd like to do this interview today. We'll go through the basics, and then hopefully we can do some interviews down the road as we go along, and you can update us as to what's happening, because you've got a lot of stuff planned. So let's go through your background, your technical background, and then go through the whole thing that you were the guy behind the Harmonic Convergence, which a lot of people may not know. So let's go through your background first.
Okay, well, my background is that I have been an entrepreneur. I started 3 different companies. The first was an internet security company that was very successful that I started in 1992. And sold that in 1999. Before that, I worked for Sun Microsystems. I was a computer graphics expert with a degree in computer-aided design, and I was hired by Sun to help develop software to make it easy for companies to port their 3D CAD programs to the Sun platform. So that was one of my, that's kind of my origin and my background and formal training. So after working for Sun for 5 years, I started a company called Nanorex, which was an internet security company. It was the first pure play internet security company in the world. And by 1999, I had built that to about 165 employees with 7 offices in the US. And I was approached by a public company that wanted to buy my company, so I sold it. And then I retired for a few years. I started my second business, which was called Nanorex, and that was a 3D modeling program for designing and then ultimately synthesizing nanoscale machine systems. And when I first started developing the software for Nanorex, I thought maybe it would be possible to actually design and simulate on the computer nanoscale machine systems in atomic resolution, but I really doubted that in my lifetime that I could actually synthesize or fabricate these designs. And to my own surprise, 2 years after I started the company, we began a collaboration with Caltech, a group of nanotechnologists that call themselves structural DNA nanotechnologists. And what they specialize in is designing things out of DNA that will self-assemble into these larger target structures. And we began adding support in our software for designing things out of DNA that then could actually be synthesized in the lab. And we successfully did this. And by 2008, 2 years after the collaboration started with Caltech, we had a version of our software that had the full support for designing and then fabricating things out of DNA. And we were able to successfully synthesize and image nanoscale particles or target structures that had 500,000 atoms in each structure. There were a billion of copies made in one pot reaction, and we imaged that, and it was a big deal because we went from design to synthesis in just a few days, which was quite a feat. So that business, I decided to shut down voluntarily in 2009 because I was visited by the CIA, and they just gave me a friendly visit to ask me what my intentions were with the software, who was interested in using it, etc. By that time, this was right after we had our first success at synthesizing our target structure. I had been adding support in the software for laying down peptide chains, and we were beginning a collaboration with the University of Washington to incorporate a module that was called Rosetta. And Rosetta software could take an arbitrary long string of amino acids and predict the folding pattern of the protein that it would end up being. And my idea was that by providing a way for people to easily lay down peptide chains in a 3D modeling environment, and then predicting the folding pattern of that amino acid sequence, you could use these folded proteins as building blocks in the model. And we had a support in the software for storing, these structures, and then later pulling them out and using them as like Legos to build something larger. And as I was learning about this, I got interested in viruses, because viruses were living organisms. They self-replicate. They're relatively simple in structure, and so I began looking at them. And one of the things I realized pretty quickly is that even though viruses have a lot of proteins that make up all their organelles and components, they don't require very many individual proteins or types of proteins. So let me say that again. You could have, let's say, 30 different proteins that would be all the different types of proteins that you would need to create a virus. But the virus might use 1 million of those 30 proteins to self-assemble into itself. And when I realized that, and realized where we were going with this software, that it became a very big concern of mine that we were making something that a high school student potentially could use to design a synthetic virus and actually make it, because making a virus is very simple once you create the first one. And so I saw it as a real problem that the software could, it was free. We made it public domain software. And so I shut that down and retired again. And I took up ballroom dancing. And that's when I had this experience in 2012.
Yeah. And I think that's important to show that you're not a crazy guy. You actually even you're an atheist. And tell the story about the Mormon thing, because we're going to go pretty far down the rabbit hole today, and people got to realize that you're not the guy people would expect to be going down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. So my entire adult life, I've been an atheist, and a pretty hardcore atheist. I grew up in a religious environment. My grandparents on both sides were very religious. my parents weren't so much very religious, and I think it was, you know, they kind of rebelled silently, not actively, against religion because it had been so strict all their lives. So when I was born into a Christian family, but the only times I would really go to Sunday school was when we were visiting my grandparents, which was often because they didn't live far away in Indiana, where I was born. So I got a traditional Christian education as a very young boy. And but by the time I was a teenager, I began questioning whether there was actually a God. There was no evidence in my experience, and to me, it seemed that you know, there was a lot of guilt associated with the religious dogma, and that was being used to control people. And so I suspected this. And then finally in college, I had a very good friend who invited me to a Mormon church gathering. It was one of these gatherings in which they were welcoming people who might be interested in learning about the Mormon religion. And so my friend had become interested and he invited me to come, and he was my best friend. So I went and I listened to the story of Joseph Smith and the golden plates and the angel and the, you know, deciphering of the golden plates, which became the Mormon Bible. And I was given some material to read from this Bible study group, and I took it back home and I read it, and I found it quite humorous, actually. I was laughing to myself, and that for me was kind of the last straw. I said, you know, all religions are superstitious and full of BS because, you know, it's just about people trying to control large groups of people through the dogma of religion and guilt and all of that. So I made a conscious decision to say I'm an atheist, and I remained an atheist my entire adult life. That is until something happened to me in 2012.
Yeah.
And
Now that's where I want to go. Like when I heard you told the Mormon story about Joseph Smith, it's almost like you became Joseph Smith. I was almost thinking like, is he the reincarnation of Joseph Smith? So let's go into your story. And this is why I want to build this background, that you're not the guy that should be telling this story. So let's tell the story 2012. And we had a conversation before. I pointed out the fact that Ray Hernandez had a dramatic experience in 2012. Chris Bledsoe had an experience in 2012. I had an experience in 2012. And all three of us shifted our life in a complete 180 degree. And you did the same thing. So let's go to your, how do you get into this whole UFO alien thing in 2012?
So in the spring of 2012, happened to be surfing the internet on my computer, just, hold on, my dog's.
It's okay.
Bingo, come here, buddy. So anyway, I had come across this video of the Disclosure Project, which was an event that was organized by Dr. Stephen Greer in 2001. And I had never heard of it before and just happened to watch it. It came up randomly as I was killing time and, you know, entertaining myself watching YouTube videos. And so I started watching it. It's about a 2-hour long video, and I was just pulled into it. I found it very compelling, and the people who were giving their personal testimony of either encountering UFOs or their face-to-face contact experiences, very believable. These were articulate professionals who had served in the US military or in government positions, and I found them very credible. And after watching the Disclosure Project, I was left with the realization that if what they were saying was true, this is the most important story in human history. And I wanted to know the truth about it. It was clear that if it were true, that it was being kept from the general public. And I wanted to know the truth about it. And I was intrigued by Dr. Greer because he was a civilian. He wasn't from the government or a military guy who had testify during the Disclosure Project. He was just there to organize it and kind of MC it. And what I learned quickly about Greer is that he was a doctor from North Carolina and a civilian, and he had taken his own time to organize this event, and he had written 3 books. So I bought the books, I read them, and from the books I learned that he had developed this meditative practice called the Ce5 Protocol, and had taught this protocol for initiating contact with extraterrestrial intelligence to thousands of people since the mid or early 1990s. So I thought I might want to try it. I was very skeptical, but after reading his books and finding testimonies of other people who had been to his retreats and learned the protocol, I wanted to give it a shot. So I registered for the next event, which happened to be in November of 2012 in Borrego Springs, California. I was living in Michigan at the time, so I decided to register and reserved my hotel room. And I flew out to San Diego, rented a car, drove to Borrego, which is about a 2-hour drive northeast of San Diego, and participated in this 6-day retreat. And on the 5th night of us meditating every evening in the desert, and we would typically start about 8 o'clock in the evening, and we would go until 1 o'clock in the morning. We would do this every night, and there were unusual things that happened over the first 5 days, but nothing that gave me the concrete evidence that we're not alone. This is the burning question that I wanted answered is, are they here? And if they are, who are they? So when we were sitting out meditating on the 5th evening, we had just come out of a long meditation, and somebody in the group said that they, while meditating, were given a message that something significant would happen after 11 p.m. that night. And this was probably around 10:30. So this individual was a senior Ce5 experiencer, and Greer took what he said very seriously and said, well, let's take a break here and let's get back together in our group and just watch the sky around 11. So 11 o'clock approaches, we gather back in our circle, we're sitting in our chairs. I'm gonna close this door because that sunlight's. All right, that's much better.
Beautiful. Sunny California.
So now I'm in sunny California, and the weather's beautiful. So very, very lucky. So anyway, I'm sitting with a group, and there's 25 of us observing the sky, and right where I happen to be looking in the sky, this object materializes out of thin air. And it is unquestionably a craft. That was my interpretation anyway at the time. It looked like a geodesic sphere, but it was shaped as an ellipsoid, kind of like an egg-shaped, and it was covered or defined by these triangular facets that made it look like a ruby, like a Fabergé egg floating in the sky. It was amazing, not just for the mere fact that it materialized out of thin air, but it was illuminated from within and radiating this light that was otherworldly. It really struck me with a sense of awe and of divinity. And I will never forget that moment of really feeling like I was seeing something from a higher dimension or angelic. It just had that quality of the light and the beauty of it. The light and the color was otherworldly. It's just not something I've ever seen in my life.
Can I break in and ask you, looking back, did you have any personal connection to the thing? People will describe about the fact that it was there for you, or you had some connection to it?
Well, looking back on the experience, one of the takeaways I now believe is that because it appeared right directly in my line of sight, I could not have been looking at a better point in the sky for it to see it materialize out of thin air. I now believe that it was that was on purpose. It was for me, even though it was witnessed by many other people.
Yeah.
None of them saw it materialize out of thin air like I did. And because of that, I tracked it with my eyes the entire time it was visible, which wasn't very long. It was only visible for 3, maybe 4 seconds at the most. And there were a few people in our group of 25 that didn't see it because they had their backs to it. It wasn't directly over our head. It was to the east-northeast of us, which was right in front of me, slightly to the left. But to the people sitting in the circle on the other side of me, unfortunately, they did not see it. So
How long was it there?
it was there for maybe 3 to 4 seconds. I saw it materialize, and then I saw it dematerialize just as quickly. And during this entire transition of it materializing in the sky, it never fully materialized into a solid object. I could always see the stars behind it. It was large. So as it was floating in the night sky, I could see the stars behind it. And that made me realize it was never fully materialized.
And you, like when I saw my first one, you fell off the edge of the earth, is that correct?
Well, it really shocked me, and in a good way. My initial reaction was elation, because I knew for the first time in my life that we are not alone, that we are truly not only is there life elsewhere, which to me is something to celebrate. But they're right here. You know, they're right here on Earth. That was my initial thought, was yes, indeed, they're here. They're clearly making themselves reclusive for some reason that's unknown to me and others. It's not just the government that is covering this up. It is they themselves are making themselves scarce.
Right.
And in this, I think, is a really important point for everyone who's listening to this to realize that the government isn't covering this up. They are. And there's, in my belief, there's a reason, and a very good reason and logical reason, why they're keeping themselves reclusive. And we can get into that later as I share more about my face-to-face contact experience and what I was taught by an extraterrestrial named Teshbar.
Okay, so let's get to how you go back to the site. Everybody goes back to the hotel, but you actually take your chair, you go back to the site, and then you go through this protocol in the middle of the night where you have this encounter. So go through that.
Yeah, so I was very excited, and all of us were who had seen it, and we just, for the rest of that night, talked about the implications of the fact that we saw this major sighting of this big object, and we are definitely not alone, and we were kind of comparing. And I just felt like I was on cloud 9, because I saw, now I was convinced. I had my first sighting. There was no question that they do exist and they're here. Now the questions are, who are they? Where are they from? What's their agenda? Why are they keeping themselves so reclusive? So after we ended the evening at 1 o'clock, we packed up our folding chairs, we got in our cars. I went back to my hotel and got ready for bed. I was laying in bed, and I, of course, couldn't sleep, because my mind is just going. It's ruminating about all these questions, and the excitement of that evening and what I saw juiced me up. So the last thing I could think about was sleep. And so it occurred to me after laying there for about 20 minutes that maybe I could try doing this Ce5 meditation in my hotel room. Let's see what happens. What do I have to lose? And my guess was that because it was such a major sighting, they made themselves very obvious to us, and especially to me. They were probably observing how we were each reacting to that sighting. And I assumed that they were operating with very advanced technology and they were probably monitoring me. And so I was going to go for it. I'm like, I'm here to learn and to know the truth. And if you are there, I'm ready. I'm not going to freak out. And it would be my honor to meet you. So before I prepared for my meditation, I decided it would be important in the rare, unexpected, or unlikely occasion that an ET materialized or walked into the room, I should have a greeting prepared at the very least. And so I thought about it and I decided there were three things that I would want to say to an extraterrestrial from another star system that had decided to visit me. Number one, that I was very grateful and honored. Two, that I desired a relationship, a friendship, because Greer had claimed he had made contact with a number of beings. He had friendships. A few other of the people who were there at the retreat, who had been doing it for years, claimed that they had face-to-face contact and had established friendships. And so now that I knew that they were most likely telling the truth, I wanted that intent to be known. So that was the second thing. And then the third and final thing I decided to say in my greeting is that I completely trust them to do with me and my body anything that they chose. I completely, unconditionally trusted them. And that was just because I'd heard of contactees and experiencers who were invited to go on board these craft. And I just wanted to have a general, knowing that, whatever they chose to do, that I wasn't going to freak out, and I was game for any experience, going on board a ship, whatever else. I had no idea. So then after crafting my invitation or my greeting with these three aspects, I began the meditation. I closed my eyes and I began the mantra, a 3-syllable mantra that anybody who's done the Ce5 protocol knows. It's I'm Na Ma. There's a tonality to it. It goes, I'm Na Ma, I'm Na Ma. And you close your eyes and you do a thought sequence visualization. And after about, I would say 3 to 4 minutes into doing that, I noticed in my mind's eye a swirling pool of light, like a whirlpool, emerging in my third eye. And it was very faint at first, but it was there. And I just continued to focus on it and continue with the mantra. And it began to slowly condense into a sphere. It was like swirling, and then all this light was coming together into a well-defined bright sphere, and it got very bright. Very unexpected. I'd never had an experience like that before. And so I just stayed with it and continued the mantra. And then these rings of light came from my periphery into this orb or into this sphere. And that continued for about a full minute. And then that stopped. And then this orb began to slowly morph into a humanoid figure standing right in front of me. And I just sat there, kept keeping my eyes closed, keeping the mantra going, and waiting for something to happen to this image that I'm seeing with my eyes closed. And it's persistent. It's just there. It's not moving. So finally, after 5 or more minutes, I decided to just open my eyes and see what would happen. And when I opened my eyes, standing at the end of my bed is a light beam, as if my eyes had been open the entire time. But now, because my eyes are adjusted to the darkness, I can make out my room. There's enough, light in the nighttime, and my eyes have adjusted. I can make out the room, and he's standing in front of curtains in a window, and I can see through parts of his body, and he's clearly not physical. It's purely made of light. If I had seen this at any other time in any other context, I would have assumed either it was a ghost or it was a hologram. It was very thin. It was roughly my height, about 5'10", 5'11" in height. Its head in proportion to its body was somewhat larger, slightly larger than a human head to its body. The most unusual thing about its head initially that I noticed was it had what I thought was a crest. It had this, kind of bilateral sloping or slant to its head that gave the impression that it had this crest kind of going back to the back of its head. But the rest of its face and the shape of its head was like a human. And it had eyes that were round, not the almond eyes that you see with the grays or the classic aliens. These were just normal round eyes, but there was a slit for a pupil. And I wasn't afraid at all. I just was blessed. I felt, this is just amazing. And I sat there as I looked at it. The other unusual thing about him, he was scintillating a little bit. There were parts of his body that were sparkling. Now his face was opaque, very bright. And so I couldn't make out if it had a nose or a mouth. If it had one, my guess is that they were very small. I didn't see any ears, kind of poking out of the side of his head. And the other unusual thing is the fact that he was so bright. I should have seen some reflection light or ambient light lighting up the walls around him and the bed in front that he was, right in front of. And there was not that. And it was really weird. My training, as I said earlier, is in 3D computer graphics. And I've personally written programs way back in the day when I was young on taking 3D data and rendering a realistic scene. And it's really important to get the lighting just right if you're after realism. And so you pay a lot of detail to, ambient light sources or light sources and the ambient lighting effects and specular highlights. And as I'm looking at this thing, something's missing. Something's missing from the scene, and it's that there's no ambient light. And I now believe that what I was actually seeing was a composition of my third eye that had been activated, the third eye, the pineal gland, and that I had actually been seeing this being before I opened my eyes with the third eye. And when I opened my eyes, what I was then seeing was a composite image of what my vision was, the room, and the perception of this being. And my guess is that if somebody else had been in the room with me, they would not have seen Tejbar, this being that later introduced himself as Tejbar.
Wow.
So
did he have clothes on?
No clothes that I could make out. He was just scintillating. Okay. And again, he had this very thin neck, pretty broad shoulders for as skinny as he was, and a thin body that tapered down, very masculine. It wasn't, feminine. There was nothing feminine about this creature or this entity that was standing in front of me. It came across as a very masculine energy and visual being. And so he had these long arms. They were slightly longer than human arms, or maybe it was just the fingers were significantly longer than human fingers. I couldn't count his digits because his hands were at his side. So, like this. And I tried counting his fingers, but there was no way. And the glow around his hands as well made it very kind of fuzzy. So I couldn't see specifically what his fingers looked like. All I could tell is that his fingers were longer than human fingers.
Was there more emotion at this point or excitement? Did the excitement increase, or what happened there? Or were you just observing?
I was just observing because just hours before I'd seen this craft materialize out of thin air, and then it vanished. It dematerialized, and I was kind of worried or half expecting for him to just vanish. He was just showing me that he exists, and there he is. I didn't know what was going to happen. But I wanted to observe him, to burn into my memory what I was looking at, because I'm a fairly decent artist, and I wanted to render a picture of what I had seen. And so that was my initial goal. And I was also, there was this sense of awe of what I was experiencing. There very much was. I was really blown away that I was having this experience, and I knew immediately what a privilege it was to be standing in the presence of some, highly intelligent being that was clearly not physical. That was, hard to compute at first, because again, being an atheist and not believing in ghosts or the spirit realm or any of that, this was kind of an awakening of sorts. So I'm dealing with that.
Can I jump in with one question, sort of off topic? But you said that you're a pretty good artist. In your regular set where you do your interviews in your home, you have some art on the wall. Is that your art? And do you do art like? Are you an actual painter where you paint?
I'm not a prolific artist, but I have painted and drawn pictures myself. But it's I think the last piece I did was maybe 2 years ago. So it's and I've never rendered a picture of Tejbar, as it turns out. Every time I've attempted to do it, it's just not right. I can't get the essence, and so I've given up the few times that I've attempted to do it. It's just
The reason I mentioned is because we're doing a series on experiencers who are artists. There's a pretty clear connection between the two, or with music. The other one is music. But so anyway, so you're with Tejbar now. Describe introducing what happens next, and get to that part of the story.
So once I've taken the time to burn into my memory what I'm looking at, I decide to give my greeting, and I do it telepathically. I didn't say it out loud, because I now believe that what Greer and others were saying is that they can read your mind. You don't need to say things out loud. So I gave him my greeting telepathically. And I said what I mentioned earlier. I'm very honored and grateful to have you here. I hope this is the beginning of a lifelong friendship. And I trust you to do with me and my body anything that you wish. I completely trust you. And as soon as that thought was finished, that greeting was finished, he began walking around the end of my bed and approaching me on my left side. And I'm like, uh-oh, I was sitting up, and I was not, I didn't want to move a muscle. I didn't want to give him any cause to run away or to think I would do anything. So I was just going with it. But I was starting to get a little freaked out, but not bad, because he was very slowly coming towards me. It wasn't quick at all. And I was just glued to his eyes, because those eyes were, I mean, if you have an extraterrestrial walking slowly towards you, you want to look in his eyes. And as he approached me, and then he stopped, and he's right next to me on my left side, I'm looking up to it in his eyes, and his face couldn't have been more than 2 feet away, 2 feet or less. I'm looking into his eyes, and what I realize is that I'm not looking into his eyes. I'm literally looking into sockets of a skull. And what I thought were pupils were the optic nerve canal, that part of the orbital socket that, the optic nerve from the eyeball goes to the brain. And when I saw that, I'm like doing a double take, like, is this really what I think it is? And the confirmation came because I could see the little platelets in the orbital. The inside of the orbital, or the eye sockets, are made up of a series of small bones that kind of are buttressed up against each other, and they're these little fissures that are very identifiable. And I recognize those fissures in the sockets of his eyeballs. And as this is beginning to compute, I notice something's moving. I look down, and it's his hand. He's got his index finger, and he's slowly coming towards my left elbow. So I'm just looking down like this, waiting, at my elbow. So his finger is slowly coming towards me, and I know he's going to be touching me, and I'm going to allow it. I said I trusted him, so here we go. I'm going to allow this. And he touches me, and I feel a tingly sensation, kind of like pins and needles or static electricity. It was very faint at first, but it was definitely a sensation I could feel. And then he started to insert his finger into my elbow, and that tingly feeling began to grow as he penetrated my body with his hand. And he continued to penetrate through my left side and then through my back. And as his hand is going through the right side of my body, his right shoulder is now beginning to merge with my left shoulder. And as soon as that happened, I started to freak out, because that pins and needles feeling is getting all of a sudden very intense very quickly. It was already getting intense when he was putting his hand through, and it was like, going down that big hill on the top of a roller coaster. That's what it felt like ah. And it took every bit of willpower I had to keep myself seated and still, because that fight or flight response was kicking in very quickly. And I caught myself, and I forced myself to write it out. So I allowed this being to merge with me, completely submerged himself inside of me. I am lit up, literally tingling all over. And my heart's racing. And I'm just, trying to do everything I can from freaking out. And finally, after about 30 seconds, I noticed this sensation beginning to dissipate, which gave me a sense of calming down, because it was really intense. But after, another minute or two, it started calming down to the point where I knew it was going to stop. And after another minute or two, it completely subsided. And I was left with, feeling normal again. But I had this acute awareness that there was another entity inside of me. And it's the weirdest thing, because I was so certain of it, that there was another being inside of me, another sentient being taking residence in my body, that I had to stop for a minute. Like, is this really happening? Is this really? And so as I'm, computing this and integrating it, it occurs to me, well, let's ask him a question. And my first question is, what is your name? And out loud, he says, using my vocal cords and my mouth, he says, Tezbar, just like that. And I said, Tezbar? And he said, no, Tezbar. And I said, spell it. And he said, Tezbar, Tezbar. And when he spelled it, then I could get the pronunciation, and I repeated it a number of times until I felt he was pleased. There was a real sense and a feeling I got that he was, pleased with my proper pronunciation of his name. So once that had happened, I asked him my second question, and that is, where are you from? And he says, I'm from Earth. And I'm like, what? You do not look like any creature I've ever seen from Earth. Can you explain? And he says, yes, I was once human like you. I lived roughly 3,000 years ago in an area that is today called Tierra del Fuego. You will find it at the southern tip of South America. Well, I had never heard of Tierra del Fuego, and this came through so clear that I wanted to confirm it. I had my laptop, I had Wi-Fi access and internet access at the hotel, and I wanted to stop what I was doing, because it occurred to me at the time that this was all happening that maybe, although this experience had definitely happened to me, maybe it triggered in my consciousness the creation of an alter ego. And my mom is a academic psychologist, and I knew all about split personality disorder and schizophrenics, and and maybe it occurred to me, maybe I'm just imagining this and I'm creating some invisible alter ego to have a discussion with. But this was this was objective, confirmable information that I would otherwise not know. And I felt it was important to confirm it. So I got my laptop, I started Google Earth, and I typed in Tierra del Fuego in the search field, and I hit the search button. And you know how the globe begins to spin and zoom into the location that you're searching for. And I could tell it was going to the southern tip of South America. And the hair on my neck was standing on end as that's happening. I'll never forget the chills I got, because it was the hard confirmation that I wasn't crazy. It was really happening. I was having some kind of experience that I would have never imagined was possible.
Now, we discussed before, I just wanted to jump in here because you were surprised that he was from Earth. Now, when you're in the Ce5, everybody's assuming that these are aliens from other planets. So
Right.
You and I have discussed this before. What do you say about this whole controversy about who we're actually dealing with? Because yours was not an alien. It was an ascended being or whatever, right?
Well, at the time, I thought it was an extraterrestrial, in that they were either projecting a hologram to maybe protect themselves from any physical reaction that I might have to harm them, or maybe, they're multidimensional beings. That occurred to me for the first time. Well, when I saw the ship a few hours earlier, that was the first time that I had witnessed something that seemed extra dimensional, that had phased into my physical reality and then left. And so that kind of planted this concept of higher dimensional existence. So when I was looking at him, again, because of the nature of the light, and he wasn't emitting light around the room, that also gave me the idea that maybe this is a interdimensional being that I'm having an encounter with. And so, but I was very surprised that his answer was he was from Earth, especially because I had read some literature by this time, and I'd talked with enough people at this event who claimed to have contact with beings from other star systems, and nobody said that they had an experience or a contact with an Earth being. So when I found that out, I wanted to confirm what he had said. And before I put away my computer, I decided to Google his name. It was such an unusual spelling. I didn't expect anything, but when I Googled it, it turned out that there was one hit in the entire Google library. And when I clicked on the link, it took me to a book that had been published in 1916 and was in the Google Docs library. It had been scanned and converted into electronic text. And in that electronic copy of the book, that book was, again, written by an anthropologist named Jonathan Cooper, published in 1916. And the title of the book was The Tribes of Tierra del Fuego. And in the back of the book, there's a glossary of common words that were translated from the native tongue of what's called Fuegian language of those tribes in southern Argentina into phonetic English. And there was a word, Tezbar, spelled exactly T-E-Z-J-B-A-R, that translated into forehead. So for me, this was another hard confirmation that I wasn't imagining this. So I put away my laptop, and I had been keeping a journal the entire 6 days that I was with Greer and taking notes every day. So I got that journal and I began interviewing this being that was clearly in my body. And my next question to him is, what happened? You were a human, what are you now? And he explained that when he died as a human, he ascended what he called the Astral Realm. And I said, well, that sounds like heaven, like the Christian concept of heaven. And he says, yes, that's what the Christians call it, but it's much more complex and involved than the Christian concept of heaven. And I said, well, is this where I'm going to go then when I die? And he said, no, not necessarily. What typically happens when a human dies is they're reincarnated to continue their journey of learning. Only under certain conditions, when certain requirements are met, do you ascend. And I asked him, I said, well, what are these requirements for ascension? And he said, well, I'll get back to that. Let's talk about other things. Basically, is the way he put it. He didn't answer that question. So I began asking him about his life as a human, and he went on to explain that he was a chieftain of a mighty tribe in the Tierra del Fuego region, and that he was loved by his people. He was a good leader. He ruled through love, and he was being of service to his people. And little did I know at the time, he was giving me a clue to the answer to the question I had just asked him, which later I just he left me the answer to this question, which I'll mention in a moment. So as we're talking about this, so I said, so you're saying that I was alive in a previous lifetime, that I'm reincarnated, and that I've been somebody else. And he says, yes. And I said, well, who was I before I was Mark Sims? And he said, you were a wolf, which blew me away, because when I was born as of course, a young boy, I began howling instinctively, howling as a baby. And by the time I was 3 years old, I was so good at howling that I would entertain my parents' friends. They would ask me to howl like a wolf. And when I would howl as a 3-year-old, I wouldn't just pretend. I really became the wolf. I remember, I have still the memory of doing this. And I was, I felt like I became the wolf when I was howling. And I developed a repertoire of all these different howls. And so, and the wolf connection has been throughout my life. So that resonated with me. And so there much more happened over this period of time that speaks to this question of my previous life being a wolf. But basically, what I was learning from Tejbar is that we indeed are, that reincarnation is a truth, according to Tejbar. And he went on to explain that before we become human, we go through the animal kingdom before we enter the human kingdom. Those are his words. That individuated consciousness begins in the animal kingdom with the most simple animals with the smallest brains. And he gave examples of the arthropod family as, where that process begins. And that when insects live and then they die, their developing soul, which he called the astral body, which is just a phase of the soul's evolution, is reborn or reincarnated into another insect for many thousands of lifetimes. And that insect stage is the first stage of a 4-stage process before we get to the human stage of consciousness. And
so I just wanted to interrupt, because you were mentioning this thing about the astral body being inside. Did he not mention this fact that it's like a butterfly, like inside a cocoon, that as you're living, you're building your astral body for the next life, and that when you die, the butterfly emerges and moves to the next body, that you're actually building an astral body while you're living? Is that correct?
That's correct. That's right. And so this astral body is developing through the incarnations of initially simple animals into more and more complex. The stage 2 family of animals he said were the reptiles, amphibians, and fish. Stage 3, and I'm just generalizing, birds and waterfowl. Stage 4 is mammals and marsupials, and stage 5 is human. And that there is a first incarnation as a human. And what I learned later, I thought when he had explained all this to me, that Mark Sims, this incarnation as Mark Sims, was the first human incarnation. But I learned after, after a while, that through his help, that I had been a human and that I had a karmic debt to pay, because I was this Native American warrior. I had killed an alpha male wolf out of ritual. I had not gotten the permission from the elders. I had done it kind of as a rebel, and there's a whole backstory to that. But the bottom line is that because I murdered a wolf, an alpha no less, when I died in that lifetime, I was reincarnated as a wolf to pay a karmic debt. But it turns out that, according to Tejbar again, that the wolf experience, which is one of the great spirit animals in Native American culture, what prepared me for this life. That my business success and my leadership abilities, according to Tejbar, came from, in part, from the fact that my most recent incarnation was as a wolf, and that I had led a pack. I'd started my own clan and grew it to, how many ever, wolves were in that pack. And that prepared me for this lifetime.
And so there's the 3 different levels. So you have your first level is your humans, and then you ascend. Is there, I think you were mentioning in one of your lectures, this fact that whatever is your hang up, that's where you come back to learn empathy and understanding. So if you're a racist or whatever, you'll come back into that's part of it as well, right?
Absolutely. So here are some of the big picture things that Tejbar explained to me. Number one, that the earth is a soul factory. Think of it as a soul factory, and that all of nature is participating in the evolution of consciousness, that being humans and beyond. And he shared with me what happens, after we graduate to the next stage. And the experience we're having is a physical experience in what he termed the physical realm. The 3 levels that you spoke of are the 3 realms of creation, according to Tejbar. So you have at the very top, the top realm you could think of in a hierarchical standpoint as the celestial realm or the etheric realm. The next realm is the astral realm, and the most dense is the physical realm. And so you have associated with each one of these realms at 5 stages of conscious evolution. And overlaid on top of that are the dimensions of consciousness. So you have famously said, and I love this, it's all about consciousness. And that is at the heart of what Tejbar taught me, that what's really going on here is a conscious experience. And we are evolving collectively as individuated conscious beings in an orchestra or in a choreographed theater. And some of us are at the beginning of this process, others are much further along. And according to Tejbar, he was much further along and was sharing with me what it was like for him to go from the human stage of consciousness to the stage he was now at, which was at the highest level, the celestial level. So he went on to explain that he had ascended 3,000 years ago, according to our timeline, to the astral realm. He spent a lot of time there going through 5 additional stages of conscious evolution. He went into some detail about what each one of those was about and the purpose of those. And then he talked about the second ascension from the astral to the celestial. And he gave the analogy, just like from the physical to the astral level, there's a butterfly developing inside the cocoon that gets released. And that's what this ascension process is about. So, so what I would like to share with everyone, if I may, is a chart that I developed with his tutelage. And this chart is called the Universal Consciousness Development Chart. And it's an attempt to explain these 15 stages of conscious evolution with the overlaid 15 dimensions of consciousness and the other dimensions of reality. And it's a model for explaining what we're going through. And it's a real mind blower. And I'm coming out, really, this is the first time since I gave that presentation in 2013, publicly bringing this to the public, and much more detail than I did, because I limited myself to an hour. And I was still learning as well. So
now, let me just go back to, you did that presentation the year after your experience. So the question comes, what did Greer say after you talked to him about what had happened? What was his reaction?
well, I never talked to Greer again about this. I did go to another CE5 retreat with him, but I never approached him and shared with him what I had experienced back in 2012.
Wow.
And there were a number of reasons I decided not to do that. My intuition, my gut told me not to say anything to him. And I imagine, Stephen's a well-known guy in this area, and he's a very busy person.
Yeah.
And I just didn't feel it was appropriate for me to approach him and share with him everything that was happening to me. And I was still relatively shy about coming out. And there were things that happened immediately after, when I returned back to Michigan, that were not very pleasant. When I finally shared with my wife what had happened in California and what I was experiencing. And so what I was experiencing, according to Tejbar, was a communion experience. Now, I had read the book Communion back in the 1990, roughly. It had been a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. I was not into ETs or UFOs, but because this book had become so popular and it had such a interesting image on the cover, I decided to read it. And so I had read that book. And when, during my own communion experience, Tejbar explained to me that first morning of our communion, he said, "You are having a communion experience." And he went on to share with me that it's the union of three things: the physical body, the astral body, and the celestial body. And little did I know at the time that this was a huge clue to who and what Tejbar was. He said that of course, it's my physical body, and I learned, through him, that I have this soul, or a developing soul, that's called the astral body. And then there's this celestial body that he was. That's non-physical, that's, a higher dimensional, ascended being that had merged with me, and we were in a form of communion or Trinity. And that's exactly how he described it. And I later went to read, a definition of communion. The communion I knew was the one from, Catholicism, the Eucharist. But there's another definition in the Webster Dictionary that it's the intimate sharing of feelings and emotions between two or more people. And that's exactly what was happening, because I was communicating with Tejbar initially with telepathy in a dialogue. It was a back and forth dialogue, but this soon evolved into what I would call downloads. I would ask a question that would require a lot of information, a complex answer to fully answer my question. And instead of him telepathically transmitting the knowledge to me in dialogue form, he began feeding me information. And I think these are what most people call downloads. And initially, these downloads were given to me like plates of food. I love this analogy because it really is true for myself when I was experiencing this, that I was presented an answer on a plate. And on the plate was the information, the answer to my question. And I would take a bite and I'd swallow, and then I would regurgitate what I just learned in that first bite. And Tejbar would acknowledge that I indeed had received the information correctly. And initially he would say, right. And then he would have these falling stars. I was doing this with my eyes closed. And these falling stars would appear in my third eye as I asked the question, is this right? Is this right? Regurgitating the information I was learning. And every once in a while I wouldn't get that falling star and he would say no. And I would have to rethink it or re-eat that piece of information, and then I would get it right. And over time, over the next few days, I became so good at integrating these downloads of information that I didn't need the falling stars anymore. I would just know instantly everything I needed to know. But it took some training and getting used to doing that.
So now he was with you for what, 12 days?
13 days.
13 days. Okay.
Yeah, 13 days. And so communion was what he called it. And he left me on of course, the 13th day, and I'll share with everyone what that was like. But before I get into that, I want to, share with you this chart that I developed over this 13-day period.
Okay.
So I'm going to share the screen, and this is called the Universal Consciousness Development Chart. Can everybody see that okay?
Yep.
And so what you're looking at is a two-dimensional projection of a multi-dimensional reality. And I know that's a lot to take in, but let me explain. So in the yellow area, you have 15 boxes grouped into 3 rows. And the 3 rows, starting with the top, is the celestial realm. Below that, the astral, and below that, the physical.
Yep.
And in each one of these realms, we have 5 boxes, and those represent the 5 stages in each one of these realms of the soul's journey or evolution to the next stage of its experience. And so we have basically 5 overlaid on top of that, on top of these 15 stages of the soul's evolution, you have 15 dimensions of consciousness, as explained to me. And he went through and explained what these are. In the physical realm, they are the 5 physical senses. Okay? So they really don't have anything to do with the stages, the discrete stages of the soul's evolution. It just, think of them as inputs to your consciousness of your immediate surrounding.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's what we mean by dimension. I also like to use the term awareness. These are dimensions of awareness, and we can turn them on and off at will. We can close our eyes and we've turned off one of the dimensions of consciousness.
Okay.
Okay. The next stage is the astral realm, and there are, according to Tejbar, 5 additional dimensions of consciousness at that stage, and he went into some description about what those are. And those are ESP, telepathy, astral travel or projection, and remote viewing is a type of that conscious dimension. Communal mind or hive mind, this is where 2 or more minds join together in one social memory complex, according to the law of 1 in the raw material.
Yep.
This I recognize as exactly what Tejbar was talking about. And then I believe the fifth level is the emotional, is emotion itself. Emotion so astral beings experience emotion, but what I've learned is that it's much different than the kind of emotions that we experience in the physical realm. Because we have physical bodies and we can feel pain, we can experience loss, which in the astral and celestial realms, they're existing outside of time and space. They lose nothing. Everything's in the Akashic record. So they can always access a object, a loved one, a memory. So there's no loss at these levels of or realms of consciousness. So it's only in the physical that we experience extremes of emotional grief or ecstasy. And so that's just an important point to make here. Okay. At the celestial level, these dimensions of consciousness we associate with, God realization, unity consciousness, love consciousness, omniscience. These are as close as words will come to the experience of conscious existence at the celestial level. Tejbar shared a kind of an allegory or an analogy for me because when we were starting to talk about these levels of consciousness at the very highest levels in this chart, he was saying, Mark, I am the frog and you're the tadpole at the bottom of a pond. You're in the water. You think that everything around you is the pond. But little do you know that above the pond, there's air and animals and creatures that are flying through the air, and that you're going to be one day in that realm. You're going to come out of the water and you're going to become the frog and breathe air. And I'm like, well, what's air? So he was trying to explain to me that there was no way for him to explain to me, because it's outside of my experience, what these levels of consciousness really are like. And so he just gave me some examples, but he was saying they don't capture the essence of what consciousness and conscious existence is like at the highest levels. That is something that I'll experience at a later time. So he did also explain to me that he was a level 12. He was in the 12th level of the celestial stage of, in this chart, he was at stage 12 of his own journey. And so he had gone through a second ascension. He shared with me what that was like, which was really enlightening and an amazing story that I write about in the book that I'm about to publish. But so that's what the 15 yellow boxes are.
Now you mentioned that he had talked about when you get to his level, that all these people are coming back that used to be on the earth, and that's why we're having this integration, and they're upset with what's going on, and they're here to help. So can you explain that concept?
Yeah, he said the way that this works, when there is the second ascension, when the astral being ascends to the celestial level, they go through a period of transition and adjustment. It's like being born again. Just like when you ascend from the physical to the astral, there is this very intense adjustment for your consciousness. And people who have had near-death experiences come back and tell stories about being greeted by people who are deceased to tell them that they're not ready and they have to go back, that kind of thing. And there's often a very bright light. And what Tejbar explained to me is that these are indeed astral beings that are part of your soul group. They're, your loved ones that are there to help you through that transition, because immediately after you're dead, you still associate with your physical life and the form of that body that you thought you were. And they're there to kind of handhold you through the process, because what ends up happening through this period of transition and adjustment, and this is stage 6, this all happens in the very beginning of stage 6 in this chart, is that you begin to have recall of your previous lifetimes. And it's very confusing to integrate that. And what happens is the people that are your loved ones sitting there helping you through this transition, they will shift into the people that you were in lifetimes before your most previous lifetime. And that will help you on your way to integrating and, you know, adjusting to your new conscious experience. And so you have an energy body. It by and large takes on the form of a star tetrahedron. So if anybody's heard of the Merkaba,
Yep.
that is what Tejbar explained to me. And that's why stage 6, if you look at this box, I show a 6-pointed star, or the seed of life. This is a sacred geometry figure that I incorporate here because this is the sacred geometry associated with the star tetrahedron. It's a 2-dimensional projection of the star tetrahedron, which itself is a 3D projection of a higher dimensional being. So that's really important to, let me say that again. Astral beings are higher dimensional beings, but when they project or manifest into the physical realm, what you're seeing is a 3-dimensional projection of a higher dimensional being. And if you take that 3-dimensional projection and further project it down into 2 dimensions, it looks like the Star of David. Okay. So in all these cases, I've included a sacred geometry figure where they're here to denote something significant, a analogy between sacred geometry and the stage that we are going through in our conscious evolution. And again, this is all according to Tejbar.
Symbol, let me ask you about the symbol you got in the bottom left, the Greer triangle from the crop circle. What's a lot of experiences will talk about having the triangle on their wrists that they find. What's the symbolism of the triangle? Is that something really special?
I believe it's the Trinity that I spoke to of earlier.
Okay.
It's the unity of the physical, the astral, and the celestial.
Okay.
And the celestial, I learned much later, Tejbar himself is my higher self. It's that channel to God consciousness, to the Godhead. And it came to me at a time in my life when I was ready for enlightenment. I was wanting to know the truth about something very important to me, about the world and about reality, about the existence of ETs and UFOs. But little did I anticipate or expect that would get into this whole question about the afterlife and reincarnation and about higher realms, about heaven.
Wow.
It's a pretty amazing journey I've been on, and anybody, and there are others, I'm not the only, but it's a real mind blower, and it forces you to go through a reconciliation. And it's at times very challenging to let go of my previous worldview as an atheist.
Well, that's what I was pointing. You came a long way. You came from one end of the spectrum right to the other end of the spectrum, almost like in a couple of hours. Do you think there was or did you talk to Tejbar about, was there an agreement between you and he to do this thing before birth, or was this planned, or is this random?
I've never talked to him about that. I am very aware of people who are reincarnated who believe that they had some kind of soul contract or some agreement to reincarnate for some specific purpose. And I do believe that that's true. And this very well may be one of the purposes to my life, is to share this knowledge with the rest of the world. And why I feel it's so important is because we are at the cusp of a major awakening that is instigated by the fact that we are facing an existential threat of our own making, the overpopulation of the world, without taking responsibility for ourselves in the treatment of nature and of our ecosystems and of each other in a loving way. And that our ancestors, these other family members that have moved on, are now ascending to the celestial level and returning to Earth. So according to Tejbar, when he ascended the second time, he was out in the cosmos doing his thing in the astral body, but the process of transition and adjustment is so intense. He called it the ultimate painful and pleasure experience, like, the most painful orgasm you could ever imagine.
Okay.
And that his body, or his energy body, was pulled back to Earth, and Gaia, Mother Earth, cradled him and nurtured him while he's going through this experience, anchoring him and grounding him so that he doesn't, cease to exist. She's kind of keeping that energy together from just dissipating, because it's like a nova of energy, supernova of energy. So it comes back to the Earth. She cradles it and keeps it contained so that it can adjust and become, get used to its new existence as a celestial being. And then as it, develops its legs, so to speak, like an infant, it begins to explore in its new state of consciousness. And for Tejbar, what he explained, he wanted to check out Tierra del Fuego and the area down there. And what he saw happening there in our timeline right now is that his sacred homeland, his sacred lands, were being desecrated by oil and gas exploration, deforestation, and he was horrified by what was happening down there. And so, according to him, in our first 24 hours of communion back in Borrego Springs, I tell the story in my book that's coming out about doing yoga. I was doing yoga daily back in 2012, and I had not done yoga since I had arrived in Borrego Springs, and I really felt I needed to exercise and stretch. And so I had communed with Tejbar. I had not slept all night. I wanted to go out in the desert and continue my communion, but I thought doing it as I'm meditating and doing yoga, a little yoga routine, would be helpful. As I'm doing this yoga routine, he's sharing the story about his own second ascension and what that was like. And that he says to me, I have committed myself to healing our mother. Will you join me in a partnership to help heal our mother? And I buried my hands in the sand and I committed my life to doing that. And so that is what I'm attempting the best way I know how to do. And he went on to share with me, Grant, that he was one of the early ones to ascend. But there's a whole flood of souls that have gone through this process and are going through and have gone through the ascension, the second ascension, and are residing in the earth, ready to come out. And they want to commune with us to help us in this unity, in this, communion unity, to solve these problems that are ailing our earth and each other. So I feel like a bit of an evangelist, saying this, but it's true that I feel that I'm on a mission from the higher realms to share my story in the hopes that other people might open up to this concept that we are much more than our bodies, our physical bodies, and that we have a responsibility to our earth to take care of her. And we've neglected that. It's like we're young adolescent children that are not willing to step up and take responsibility for our actions. And we need to do that. And we need to do that with common sense. You know, this is not rocket science. This is just simply treating each other with kindness. And that's the secret here.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Let's end part one here. Name your book, and when is it coming out?
Well, right now the title of the book is 13 Days with Tejbar. The subtitle initially was A Cautionary Tale of Encountering a Celestial Being. I don't know if I'm really happy with that. I think it's a little too negative because my experience, I would change not a thing what happened to me. And I went through some really traumatic things. I was institutionalized by my family and my doctors because they thought I was bipolar and I was having a psychotic episode. And I was just being very naive. I was honest with them what I was going through. It was when I returned to Michigan. So, you know, but at the end of it, I wouldn't change a thing. And I really do believe that I'm doing the right thing here. And what I'm sharing is beautiful and it's optimistic. And we have a bright future ahead of us. We just have to take it.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear about your experience, but I think that's pretty common. We have one of the books that we helped someone publish. The woman's not allowed to see her grandkids. Chris Bledsoe, you probably know, was institutionalized. It's a hard swallow for a lot of people, and it would be the same with you, that you were in the situation if somebody had come and told you back in, say, 2005, you would have been there. You know, it's the experience that changes you. That we have to have sort of empathy for the people who really don't get it. So
of course, yeah. I don't blame my family at all what they did. I think they were acting in what they thought was my best interest, and so you know, there's no issue there, no hard feelings whatsoever.
have you communed with Tejbar about the book? Has he given you a title? Because usually a lot of times, I just made a joke about it on Facebook the other day. I mean, I had just 2 days ago. I mean, basically, I was told the new book I'm doing is called The Super Bowl, and then I was putting it out to some associates, and I was getting it ready, and this came in my head, and they said, "Of course, it's called The Super Bowl. What the hell else would you call it?" And it was like, it just basically came into my head that they were telling me, "Yeah, that's what the book's going to be called." And so, did you ever ask Tejbar about? Because sometimes they'll give you the name of the book, what they want it called. Because it's same with if you know the story about communion, the book. You know the story about communion with
I do.
with Whitley, where his wife is channeling in the middle of the night. He was going to call it body pain, and then his wife says, "No, we won't call it body pain. We shall call it communion because that's what it is," and that's where the title comes from.
You know, I haven't thought to do that. Thank you for bringing that up because I'm not happy with the subtitle. I'm very happy with 13 Days with Tejbar. That's perfect. But the subtitle I've got to think about.
Beautiful. So let's do a quick part two here, because I want you to go through some of the stuff that you're doing on your mission. Spend a couple minutes talking about the
Harmonic Convergence?
Harmonic Convergence that you did in July. And then let's get to the radios, because this is something new that I want to do one, and we may do another one to get more into it, because you've got some videos that we can maybe share in another one. But I want to basically go over the Harmonic Convergence, why you did that, and then how did you get wrapped into this radio thing, which I'm telling you is impressive. I've seen a lot of stuff. I've been in this 46 years. And it is one of the wildest things I've ever seen in terms of possibly convincing people that this is for real. Yeah.
So, well, you know, back in 2012, I returned back to Michigan. After about 2 or 3 days, I shared with my wife that I had a face-to-face contact with an extraterrestrial back in Borrego Springs. I did not tell her about the communion and the merging or anything.
Yeah.
I knew that was going to be really tough for her to believe. And I thought I could maybe broach the subject by saying, hey, there's this thing I have to tell you. When I told her that I had this face-to-face contact experience, she completely freaked out and insisted that I see a doctor, that I had been acting strangely since my return. And I was still in this state of communion, and I wasn't sleeping very much. And, I was isolating myself in my office and continuing to talk to Tejbar and learn many of the things I shared with your viewers. And so when she insisted that I see a doctor, I agreed. And a few days later, I ended up going to the University of Michigan Hospital. I went through a barrage of physical exams, and then the afternoon I spent with some psychiatrists who at the end of the day institutionalized me and voluntarily committed me.
Wow.
And I spent 20 days in the University of Michigan psych ward, diagnosed with bipolar disorder and effectively being forced to take olanzapine and lithium for an bipolar disorder diagnosis I didn't believe I had. But it made logical sense why they would believe that.
Yeah.
So I was released on December 20th or December 16th, 2012. I then ended up having, because of my transition and my complete flip of my worldview in terms of, the afterlife and reincarnation, I wanted to explore that, and my wife was very uncomfortable with me even meditating. She made me promise not to meditate, and I told her I wasn't going to meditate. Well, I wanted to pursue this, and for lots of reasons, I decided to file for divorce. That was in the summer of 2013, and then I went on to begin meditating again, and I was having these incredibly beautiful meditative experiences with what I called light shows in my third eye. I was getting these downloads, and I was communicating with Tejbar. I was reunited, and when it first happened, right after I moved out of my house, after separating, it was very emotional for me because I felt it was a reunion of sorts. I really missed that experience of the 13 days that I'd had previously. So I began a very strict meditative practice, and I was eating primarily vegetarian food. This was something that was encouraged by Tejbar. And I was getting, during my meditations, more information. And eventually that led to a experience in 2015 in which I was meditating one morning, and I had a full-blown vision. I mean, this vision was so vivid that it was like watching a movie on my eyelids. I mean, that was really something. The first time that happens is really wild. And the vision starts with, I'm flying through the sky. I'm above the cloud deck. There's a thick deck of clouds below me. I can see the sun that on the horizon. It looks like it's setting or rising. And then I descend through the clouds, and when I pop out, there's a desert scene below me. And there is in the distance a gathering of people with lots of campers and tents and teepees. And I go to, to this location, and what I see there are a bunch of people gathered around a stage. And on the stage are 3 screens. Big jumbotrons that have different images on each of the screens. One of the screens, for instance, has what appears to be maybe the forbidden city of China, with a bunch of people sitting in front of the screen. There's another scene next to that of the Eiffel Tower. So, immediately it's Paris. And in the foreground are all these people seated in the lotus seating position, meditating, with their backs, but they're looking at the Eiffel Tower, or maybe they were looking towards the screen. So it was clear that they had the Eiffel Tower in the background and they were facing the camera, and that camera was projecting the image from Paris on one of the screens. And then the third screen had some other location that was unfamiliar to me, with another group of people in the foreground who were meditating. And as I'm watching this, a date appears in my vision, just like, some fancy text popping up on the screen on a PowerPoint presentation. And it's July 5th, 2020. And that dissolves and a new date pops up, July 14th, 2020. And that date dissolves and then the scene goes away. And I continue meditating when the vision ends. And what I get is that this is a 10-day event that I am going to be organizing, that is for the purpose of having a world meditation for peace, for peace and unity. So 8 days later, I'm in California at a festival at what's called Lightning in a Bottle. And on the last day of the festival, I had been up late, and the festival was over the next Monday, and I didn't get a lot of sleep that night, but I got up and I have this daily practice. So I began meditating again 8 days later from the first vision, and I have the exact same vision, exactly. So in the meditation, at the end of the vision, I get a very clear message. I am being given a mandate to organize this event, and that it's a global meditation that's going to go over a 10-day period from the 5th of July to the 14th of July. And so I get the message clear, and I began doing some internet research. I've started 2 businesses, or 3 businesses by this time. I had a third business that I started back in Michigan called Vortrex, which is a renewable energy company. This was my attempt to, fulfill my vow of making the world a better place. I knew that we needed to get off fossil fuels and clean up our act ecologically. And I felt if I could help accelerate the adoption of solar and wind or renewable energy products, that could be one way I could help. So I had started a third company by this time, but this new project of starting or organizing a global event to meditate together for world peace, I had no idea how to do it, or if it had even been done before. So I did a Google on global meditation, and I discovered that the very first time that an attempt was made to synchronize a global meditation for any purpose, but the original purpose was to promote world peace and unity, was the Harmonic Convergence in 1987, or was it 86? It was August 16th and 17th, I believe, of 1987. And it was organized by a man, Jose Arguelles, who, like myself, had a vision while he was at the pyramid outside Mexico City. I always forget how to pronounce that. Teotihuacan.
Okay. Yeah,
He was there as a young boy. He was 14 years old and had just ascended the steps to the very top of the pyramid, and he had a vision come to him. And that vision was to organize this Harmonic Convergence event. And so I was mesmerized when I discovered this, because the whole origin story had so many connections with my own personal experience. And I also learned that coincided with a major alignment of the planets. So on a whim, I decided to get this program called Stellarium, which is a public domain free planetarium program for your PC. And I put in the date and I looked, and lo and behold, the planets line up like incredibly well on this period from July 5th to July 14th in 2020. So this is another synchronicity and confirmation to me that I'm not just crazy. This is really a divine request of me to organize this thing. So this was again in early 2015, and I have 5 years to kind of get my act together, to put a plan together and try to figure out how am I going to pull this off, and which I end up doing. There were times throughout that 5-year period when I kind of stepped back and like, this is just too crazy. It's too much for my family. I'm putting myself out there too much. But luckily and thankfully, I overcame that apprehension and had the courage to do it. And I've received so many letters from people, emails, personal calls over the year, since the summer, that the harmonic convergence really changed some people, really helped some people. I know of at least one case in which a marriage or they're not married yet, but they're going to be married. A couple came together because of the harmonic convergence. They didn't know each other. And that was a really beautiful story. But many people have told me that it changed their life in a positive way. And so I'm very proud of that. And, but I'm not done. There are other things that I've done in an attempt to.
I should let me just interrupt you just for a second. Our producer, Desta, joined you. She's quietly in the background, but she was with you during the harmonic convergence. She was.
Oh, wonderful.
So even people that haven't talked to you, we're doing it. So it's wonderful.
Yeah, we had over 200,000 people register for the harmonic convergence.
Wow.
And I think we have had over 1.5 million people watch the videos that are posted for each of the 10 days. Wow. And by the way, I wanted to share this story. This is a story I've not shared with very many people, and I certainly haven't spoken publicly. So you kind of have a scoop here. But in 2017, I was contacted by a friend who was from Milan, from Italy. And he had just, he lives now in LA, and he and I had met and had been friends for a little while. He went back to Italy, to Milan over Christmas in 2016, and was visiting an old friend of his, and shared with that person my picture and my story about my communion experience with Tejbar. And this was a woman friend of his who said, "You have to introduce me to this guy. I need to meet him." So over the course of the next few months, my friend said, "Hey, I have this friend back in Italy who really would love to meet you. And she says it's very important." So he set up, I agreed to, speak with her. And she explained to me that she would like to meet me face to face, and that she was a very successful and sought after astrologer. And she, in fact, was an advisor to some very important people in Europe and the Middle East. And at first I didn't know what to make of it. And, I had by that time, though, had read enough about astrology, and with Tejbar's encouragement, I had studied astrology just, a little bit, and believed there was something to it. Here you have the planets aligning during the harmonic convergence of 1987 and 2020. So there must be something to this at the very least. And so I was open-minded about it, but in any event, she just said, "You can be my guest. You can stay with me and my family. I never allow any of my clients to stay with me and my family. I live in Italy, and I would like you to stay with me. And, I want to share my story with you and ask you more about your story, because we have a connection that I want to tell you about, but I will only tell you about it if you come to Italy." So this was in early 2017. And she was very busy. She has a very busy schedule. She travels all over the world, especially, the Middle East and Europe. And she had just a few slots in her schedule over the summer in which I could spend time with her in Italy. So she gave me 3 slots, dates. And one of those slots was from July 5th, 2017 to July 14th. So I picked that. Obviously, she had no clue about this vision I had about the dates and the significance of it. So I decided that was a type of confirmation in synchronicity. And so I took it as a good sign. I made my arrangements. I flew to Italy. Her husband picked me up from the airport and took me to their home. And we had a cordial, introduction and meeting the first day when I arrived. And then the next day, which was the morning of July 6th, she begins to tell her story of why I'm there. And the story is that when she was a young girl, her father sent her to India to begin training as a healer. And so she was sent on a boat, was received by somebody in India. She was taken to an ashram, and she began as a young girl, I think of about 14 or 15 years old, if I recall correctly, being taught these different healing modalities. And one of the spiritual practices that she was engaged in or being taught was something that she did every month at the beginning of the month, in which she would meditate. There was a special meditative practice she would begin, and these names would come to her, and she would write them down. And at the end of her meditation, she would then open her eyes and begin striking out certain names on the list. And the names that were not stricken out were names of people that she would encounter in that month. And she was told to offer her services to those people when she met them. And this became a lifelong practice of hers. And in fact, this was something she continued to do into her later years. And in fact, she was born in the same year I was born. I'm 57. I was born in 1963, and we learned together that she was born the same year and around the same time I was born. So what she explained to me after telling me this method that was taught her as a young girl is that the first time she wrote her list of names, there was a name on that list that she continued every month to write and then strike out. And that name was Mark Sims. So she had been doing this her entire life. And she she knew nothing about me. She did not know why she needed to meet me. But when we got together and she shared the story with me, we both believed there was something very significant. Then I told her about the significance of the dates, July 5th to July 14th, and that was a synchronicity. So we began working together over that 10-day period, trying to solve this mystery. And we solved it. And what we discovered is it had a lot to do with the astrological significance of the dates July 4th or July 5th to the 14th of 2020. So and I'm not going to get into all the detail, but it was then that I came back from Italy that I knew I had to do this. I had a mandate that I felt obligated to fulfill, and that it was of a divine positive purpose.
Fascinating. Now let's get to the radios, and the next one I want to do maybe in next week or something is start to go through